Trump reportedly asked Zelensky on a phone call on July the 4th, the day after the call with Putin went south. He asked Zelensky, according to White House officials who've leaked this, or Ukrainian officials who've leaked this, can you hit Moscow? Can you hit St. Petersburg? So that, if Trump did say that to Zelensky, that's someone who is not just simply performing a bit. That's someone who wants the Russians punished because he's pissed off with them.
Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Professor Scott Lucas, a professor of US politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute and also the founder and editor of EA Worldview. Scott, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me here, Louis.
Well, yesterday we saw Trump's announcement of Patriot missile deliveries, battery deliveries as well, and this threat of sanctions in 50 days if Russia doesn't bring the war to a close, essentially. It's been met with a fair deal of skepticism, and I think some people could understand why. Is this a sort of U-turn on Ukraine by Trump back to where the US traditionally was, or not?
I mean, the easy part is it's a shift by Trump, because Trump had been sympathetic to the Kremlin's line, at least by giving it the space to avoid a ceasefire, for the past 6 months, and indeed until recently to ramp up those strikes, especially on Ukraine civilians. The record drone and missile strikes that we've seen in the past couple of weeks. Now, he says, and of course, it's in this very personal way, that he's the one who's been affronted by this. How could they do this to him? He has a nice call with Vladimir Putin. Then he goes and Melania says to him, oh, but did you see that the Russians bombed this today or bombed that? And then Trump goes, oh my gosh, Putin didn't tell me about that. I'm upset now. And because it's a very personal story, you get the headline of, oh, maybe he won't carry water for the Kremlin, while it continues, and this is the fundamental we got to talk about, trying to conquer Ukraine. The Kremlin is not going to compromise. And what Trump, I think, has finally realized is that, having worked to get direct talks with the Russians since February, and having thought they could get a deal which would give him not only a nice photo opportunity, but ding, 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 Nobel Peace Prize, he's not going to get it, right? And so that frustration is what comes out. Because it's not necessarily a joined up reaction in that Trump knows exactly what's going on politically, economically, and militarily, however, the question of the extent of the shift has to be worked through, especially when you have to work with the idea that the Trump administration is divided on how far to back Ukraine. And that's a fundamental that a lot of people don't pick up on. There are some people like Keith Kellogg, who was in Kyiv on Monday as Trump made his announcement, who was talking to Vladimir Zelensky about the need to hold firm against the Kremlin's attacks. Then you get people like J.D. Vance, who's been very skeptical of doing anything to help the Europeans and help the Ukrainians. So, you've got this factional dispute within there. But let's boil it down in terms of what we know. Only 2 weeks after Pop Gun Pete Hegseth, I used to call him Pistol Pete, but there was a very famous basketball player named Pistol Pete Maravich, so we'll respect him. Pop Gun Pete Hegseth says, I'm going to cut off all military aid to Ukraine because I've got this staff member named Elbridge Colby who says we should spend all our time concentrating on China and Iran. And Pete didn't consult the White House. He didn't consult the State Department. Only 2 weeks after he pulled off that move, not only have they reversed that move, but Trump is so upset with Putin, especially because he feels betrayed after the last phone call with Putin. Now he says we're going to give them some weapons. So let's start with the Patriots. Trump not only is going to provide Patriots because he's upset with Putin, but because it's a transaction, it's a business deal. He doesn't think of it as security. That is, the United States gets money from selling the Patriot air defense systems to NATO members who transfer them to Ukraine. And even though that's not because Trump is invested in Ukraine defending itself against Russia, per se, it's a win-win-win. He gets to say, look, we get $1 billion per Patriot system. NATO members get to say we're increasing our defense spending because we bought these systems. And Ukraine gets to say, we got the air defense systems we need to protect our civilians. So, that's the way that you swing that type of deal with Trump. Now, what is up in the air, Louis, is how many systems are we talking about? And that's where some uncertainty creeps in, because Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, who was in Washington on Monday, was talking about only 2 systems going to Germany. And he says we're still in negotiations over there. Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, said other countries are willing to buy systems, and he listed 6 or 7. Trump said there were 17 that they were sending across, but nobody knows whether he's referring to entire Patriot systems, which refer to multiple launchers with lots of missiles, or whether he's referring to 17 launchers, which would be part of only a couple of systems, right? Or whether he's just referring to 17 missiles. Nobody knows, right? And so we have to tease out exactly how many missiles, launchers, and systems are involved here. Then there's something beyond that, which is Trump has made a statement about sending long-range U.S. missiles to Ukraine, which could be used to attack inside Russia. Now, in some ways, that's as important as the air defense systems, because you can take the fight to the Russians and go beyond even the damage the Ukrainians have been causing with their drone attacks. There is at least one official who is going around and telling outlets that the U.S. is going to provide $10 billion in this, not quite assistance. It's going to be, in effect, selling equipment bought by others and passing it on. And that long-range missiles will be part of that. But then there's other White House officials who are saying, nah. In fact, one senior White House official says, look, Trump he thinks Russia's going to win in the long run anyway, because they've got more men, they've got more equipment and so on. So this is just simply a transaction, to look good effectively. So we don't know where we are. I think, and the White House officials, I think, are squabbling over how much more they give in terms of long range missiles. And then the sanctions, and I'm sorry to complicate it, but you have to go here. There's actually a paradox here. And that is, where we were before this week is that the US Congress, we kept waiting to see if they were going to debate this bill for what are called nicknamed sledgehammer sanctions, up to 500%, right, in terms of punishment of the value of goods that are being shipped by countries to Russia. So not only Russia gets sanctioned, but countries like China and India could get sanctioned, right? If they send 100 million in goods to Russia that aid Russia's invasion, then you multiply that by 50, and that's the level of sanction that goes on, right? Now, Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, the co-sponsors of that bill, talked to Vladimir Zelensky last week in Rome. And Graham and Blumenthal came back and said, okay, we may get debate on this fairly soon. But then Trump made his announcement, which overtook that. Because what Trump said is, 100% tariff on Russia and countries that assist Russia, but not now. Only if Putin has not ended the invasion within 50 days. Now that does 2 things. One is, if you're skeptical about Trump, what you say is, he just gave Putin a 50-day window to carry out more drone and missile attacks to try to seize more territory in eastern Ukraine, right? And Vladimir Putin said 11 days before Trump's announcement, I only need 60 days and I'm going to take over eastern Ukraine. So those people who are really skeptical are saying, look, Trump actually didn't want to do anything. He's just performing this and Putin still got space. I don't quite buy that, but I see the point. The more serious thing that's happened here is that the Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, said that because of Trump's announcement that he's going to decide when to put tariffs on the Russians, that the sanctions legislation will not proceed in the Senate. It's held up. So Trump's taken back the prerogative over sanctions for Congress, and that actually gives the Russians a bit of breathing space. So I I think it's half full, half empty what the Americans did, because if you go to the Ukrainian delegation or Ukrainian officials yesterday, what they said is, we didn't get everything we wanted, but it's a good start because the symbolism is important here. Even if you don't get all of the aid confirmed yet, even if you don't get the sanctions through yet, you now have Trump favoring your side of the narrative rather than the Russians.
And you talk there about the Russian narrative to this. We have just heard some sort of response from the Kremlin today. Reuters are reporting that sources close to Putin say this has only made him more determined, as we might have guessed, and that he's going to continue with this war. He's not changed his mind on when the war should end. How is Trump likely to read that, do you think?
Well, first of all, Louis, Putin would say that anyway. This makes me more determined. I think we need to read between the lines of the Russian response because it's actually quite interesting. The initial Russian response last night, after Trump made the announcement, was to dismiss this. And it was like, oh, this is just Trump, mouthing off. He's performing a bit, big deal. And that came from a couple of legislators who are close to the Kremlin. They changed their tune today. Initially, Dmitry Medvedev, the former president, current deputy secretary of the National State Security Council, and longtime vodka drinker, came out and said, belligerent Europe, yeah, Russia doesn't care, right? In other words, life proceeds as usual. But then the Kremlin came out a few hours later with the spokesman Dmitry Peskov and said, yeah, this is serious. We're going to consider this is serious. And Vladimir Putin will decide if he wants to respond. So I think that Kremlin line was quite interesting, that it was like, wait a minute, we can't just brush this off. We actually have to pretend that even if we don't believe it, that this is serious here, because otherwise Trump doesn't think we're taking him seriously. And we don't want that to happen because we still want to win him back to our side. So we'll see where they go with this. But I'd say that the Kremlin is going to be a little bit shaken by this. They've messed this up really, really badly. And I just want to emphasize this again. All during the period since February, they had it where they wanted it. They had the Americans with them in direct talks without Europe, without Ukraine. They had most of their conditions being accepted by certain members of the Trump administration. Certainly the real estate developer Steve Witkoff, Trump's envoy, backed them completely. Other officials were buying the idea that, yeah, it was Ukraine that was going to have to not capitulate, but give way. But Putin wouldn't stop the attacks. He would not stop the attacks. He would not give any impression of compromise, even the impression of compromise. He just kept demanding the territory, demanding the sanctions be lifted, and demanding that Ukraine be weakened. And because he kept demanding it, and especially at the start of July, that call on July 3rd, where he did not play to Trump's ego and say, you're right, we really need to sit down and talk. And then the very next day launched what was then a record attack on Kyiv and across Ukraine. I think that's, Putin at some points can be very tactically dangerous and strategically dangerous. And at times he can make gambles that don't work. And this is a big gamble. He thought he had Trump played, and it hasn't worked out that way.
So do you think there is still an element in the Kremlin that wants to rebuild that relationship with the Trump administration, or is that the death knell now for that Trump-Putin relatively warm relationship that we saw?
Oh no, they'll have to try to get Trump back here. They'll have to try to get him back or get other officials in the Trump administration back, because if they don't, the momentum here is with those who do think that the U.S. needs to step up and provide some security assistance, even if it's on Trump's terms, which is selling the weapons. And again, I think the Patriot air defense missiles are very important. Ukraine's civilian lives, the civilian will to resist is very, very important, which is what Putin's striking at. But look, those long-range missiles, we debated for months, even going on into years, whether the Biden administration would give Ukraine U.S. long-range missiles to strike inside Russia. And it was only in the last few months of the Biden administration that they would give them authority to use U.S. missiles inside Russia, and then relatively close to the border. What Trump reportedly asked Zelensky on a phone call on July the 4th, the day after the call with Putin went south, he asked Zelensky, according to White House officials who've leaked this, or Ukrainian officials who've leaked this, can you hit Moscow? Can you hit St. Petersburg? So that, if Trump did say that to Zelensky, that's someone who is not just simply performing a bit. That's someone who wants the Russians punished because he's pissed off with them. So yeah, I expect the Kremlin to, but what do they do? What can they give Trump without compromising on their desire, which is we want to seize this 20% of Ukrainian territory. We want the Zelensky government to fall. And in effect, we want Ukraine as a puppet state. Ukraine's not going to accept that. So where's the give that the Russians can give Trump to say, yeah, your Nobel Peace Prize is still waiting for you, sir?
And as is often the case with geopolitics, you mentioned that there's this win-win-win on the one hand with Europe and the US and Ukraine on the NATO paying for these missiles, or NATO members paying for these missiles. On the other hand, Europe and or the EU and Trump have gotten a bit of a tangle over sanctions or tariffs rather, and trade. Where is Trump on his new trade regulations with the European Union?
Picking up the table, throwing it in the air, and breaking all the furniture. Okay, let's just walk it through what exactly happened. For weeks after Trump's various tariff threats, which have gone back and forth, but there were still serious discussions between European Union delegation and a delegation from the Trump administration, primarily being done in Washington. And I've been following this. And last Tuesday, I was speaking at an event in Dublin that the Institute was having alongside another media organization. And there were some very smart people there. I said, look, how are the trade negotiations going? And they said, look, they're going surprisingly well. That the Trump administration officials who are involved in this are very, very serious about wanting to reach an agreement, that there have been advances which have been made. We think it's going to come up pretty soon. And I was like, okay, I'm going to file that away and see what happens. We now find out that on the Wednesday, that agreement was on Trump's desk. And that agreement was for a 10% tariff on European Union products going into the United States, that sort of baseline tariff that he sets until he gets ticked off with people. And there were also going to be concessions on cars and on steel, because of course cars are under a 25% tariff, steel's under a 50% tariff, and there are certain European states, notably the Germans and the Swedes, who really wanted those concessions. Now that had been worked out. And I thought, okay, well, that means the pragmatist had won out in the Trump administration. He never signed the deal. And I now have come from another event in Dublin today, which was addressed by the Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland, Simon Harris, where Harris effectively confirmed that. So I'm not, as it were, leaking any secrets here. Not only did Trump not sign the deal, last Saturday, we get this announcement on social media before any of the governments are informed. And indeed, Harris was, black comedy moment, joking about it today. He said, we read about it on social media. We wait for our letter because Trump has just said we're going to get hit by a 30% tariff. And by the way, that he was also going to hit Mexico with a 30% tariff. Now, the context of this is Trump was giving letters to everybody last week. Mexico got 35%. Brazil got 50%, even though the U.S. has a trade surplus with Brazil, because Trump is trying to get the charges tossed against his friend, Jair Bolsonaro, over Bolsonaro's coup attempt a few years back. So, it's not surprising on its own to get a letter like this because it's Trump performing. It is surprising to get the letter only 3 days after you thought you had a deal. And again, reading what Simon Harris was saying today, because he's not only the Deputy Prime Minister, he's the Irish Foreign Minister, I think he was genuinely surprised that this had come about. And if he's surprised, it means the European Union is surprised, right? So what happened here? I mean, I think it's important because we're going to talk about what happens next, where you go next on this, but what happened here where Trump flips. I think there's two rules in Washington you watch. First of all, Donald Trump goes with the last person in the room. Secondly, Donald Trump does crazy stuff on Fridays and on Saturdays. He does it on Fridays just before he goes to Mar-a-Lago or sometimes New Jersey to spend the weekend. And then he does it on Saturday because he gets bored. And I'm serious about this, right? And I think someone got to him on Friday, the last person in the room, before he goes off for the weekend. And I will speculate, and I will emphasize it's speculation. I don't have proof it is this person. But the person who was very prominent between Wednesday and Saturday all across US media, Fox TV, other attack channels, was Peter Navarro. Now, Peter Navarro is not a pragmatist. He's a warrior protectionist. He wasn't Trump 1.0. He isn't Trump 2.0. He is the high tariff guy. And he was going across all these media outlets bragging about how the U.S. is going to get trillions of dollars in tariffs. Now, remembering that tariffs actually are taxes, trillions of dollars of taxes on Americans. That's what you're doing. That's what Navarro was advocating. I think Navarro, maybe a couple of his allies, got to Trump and said, nah, you don't want to deal with the EU here. You want to punish it. You want to hit them, albeit with Trump saying August the 1st. So you still have that 3-week window, which we're in now, right, to see if we get the, a revision to the deal. And I genuinely don't know because the Trump administration is divided between the pragmatist, the warrior protectionist, and Trump is unpredictable, chaotic, in it for his moment, whatever his momentary impression is that makes him look good or makes him look like the bully in chief.
Well, domestically in the United States, I mean, I don't want to get too cynical with this, Scott, but do you think it's a coincidence that a lot of this action on the world stage, especially trying to get some good news around Ukraine, came as Trump was facing this almost double threat from both GOP Republicans who have been pretty frustrated with his spending bill, and at the same time, he seems to have really run afoul with the MAGA faithful over the Epstein files?
They do play what we call dead cat politics, right? You throw a dead cat on the table, say, look at that. And I think the one that came out last weekend after we get the row brewing over the Epstein files had to do with my country here, Ireland, which is the American actor Rosie O'Donnell, who says, oh, I'm going to come live in Ireland. And Trump says, I'm going to take her citizenship away, right? And like, oh, okay, great. Because he's despised Rosie O'Donnell for almost 20 years. But, so there are a bit of dead cat there, politics and ego. But I think by and large, no, I don't. Look, Trump is chaotic and manic and egotistical enough that he can operate on multiple fronts, right? And so he could be dealing with completely messing up the Epstein files case and still causing havoc, whether it be on tariffs or making his announcement on Ukraine. Let's get back to where we are with the Epstein files without going too deep into legal consequences. Yeah, we don't want to go there. Let's talk about political consequences because you nailed it. Basically, this is, if you push a conspiracy theory for years and then you're in power, don't be crying when that conspiracy theory bites you in the butt. And what happens here is that Donald Trump and his ilk, especially when they were out of the White House, were playing this thing to the hilt that those Epstein files were going to show how the Democrats, all those perverted Democrats, like the Bill Clinton and maybe Hillary Clinton, maybe Chelsea Clinton, who knows, and maybe Barack Obama, they were all involved in this, right? And this, I have to emphasize, taps into a conspiracy theory that goes back to the very start of Trump's rise to political power, which of course is with QAnon, that whack job movement, as well as some of the MAGA movements, which is the Pizzagate scandal. And I won't track through everything that's there, but you're talking about this type of thing since 2016, that the Democrats are pedophiles. It gets to the point in March where Pam Bondi, the Trumpist attorney general, we're going to get those Democrats. I've got the attorney general. I've got the Epstein files on my desk and I'm going to act on them. And everybody goes, bring out the files, bring out the files, bring out the files. Pam Bondi brings out a few of the files and there's nothing really in them. Remember that? Then it becomes known that there's a larger set of files that are there, that the FBI is in discussions with Justice Department about whether they're going to bring them out. And the decision not only is we're not going to bring the files out, the decision is Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide. P.S. There are no files. Why? They just like disappeared, right? There's no client list. There's no magic client list. And that's it. Because if you've lived on a conspiracy for years, you've lived to see Brother Bill and Hillary and all those folks get their comeuppance, and then there's nothing, then you get ticked off. And remember, what makes it serious is those conspiracy theorists are not just out on the fringes. They are part and parcel now of the American Congress, because some of them are in the US Congress, some of them are within the Trump administration. And that's why you get this entire blow up that takes place, which is that Dan Bongino, who was a podcaster mainly, becomes the assistant director of the FBI. When they don't release the Epstein files, he goes walkabout at the end of last week, and I'm still not sure anybody's seen him. He basically just doesn't check into work. Kash Patel, who is his boss, FBI director, longtime diehard Trumpist, pushing disinformation, and now he's saying, "Oh, I'm. It's not true that I'm not going to resign. I'm going to stick around." And Pam Bondi's fighting for her job as Attorney General. Where does it go? I don't know. It could, things are so chaotic that we could be moving on to something else by the time you and I talk next. But it is the case that alongside other issues for Trump in terms of people who are not quite content with his economic moves, not quite content whether or not he's going far enough in terms of the government deficit, it's just one more factor where if the economy goes bad this year, he can't play his standard tack of saying, MAGA, QAnon, everybody, come save your president. He could do it for one day. He could do it over the weekend because it was the 1-year anniversary of the assassination attempt in Butler. You can't do that every day.
Just to finish off, Scott, elsewhere domestically, we've heard that Trump has effectively been given the go-ahead now by the Supreme Court to dismantle the Department of Education. At the same time, he's facing a bit of a backlash on that because he's got several legal challenges from the states about this $6.8 billion of education funding that was held up while this decision was made. What does this say about Trump's sort of act now, ask constitutional questions later approach to legislating that he's taken in this term?
Well, I'm going to say, first of all, that Trump don't care what it says about him, because what the Supreme Court has done is they've given him a pass for now on continuing to wield the chainsaw to the government. The Supreme Court ruling does not rule that it was legal what Trump is doing to the Department of Education, because it's Congress that created the Department of Education. They should be the ones to decide what should be done with it. But what the court has said is, while the case makes its way from the lower courts and eventually possibly out to the Supreme Court to decide on the merits, Trump can proceed with the gutting of the agency rather than being constrained from doing so. So it's allowing the arsonist to continue to set fire to the building, even though you say we're not sure if it's legal that he's burning it down. What it means in terms of the specifics is I think there's two different issues, Louis, here, which is that it means the Trump administration can get away with this purging of staff to really make the Department of Education ineffective. That includes about 1,400 staff that they're trying to fire. On the other hand, what they cannot necessarily do is withhold money from the states to carry out education programs, because I think it's important to identify why the Department of Education at federal level is important, because it runs counter to the narrative of Trump and his Secretary of Education, the World Wrestling Entertainment tycoon, Linda McMahon, that you don't need a Department of Education. The Department of Education provides almost all the funding for student loans for higher education in the United States. It provides the funding that assists disabled students in the United States. It provides support for teacher training programs in the states. It provides other types of funding to ease inequalities in education systems. The states work with the federal governments on those programs. And what these states are saying is, look, even as you're trying to gut Department of Education, don't gut us by withholding our money. And I think it's not a good compromise at all. It's a horrible, horrible situation, but it'll be a small bit of salvation if the states can continue to get access to Department of Education money, even as the Department of Education almost ceases to function as an effective organization.
Well, Scott Lucas, Professor of US Politics at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute, thank you very much for joining me today on the Trump Report.
Thank you very much.